Natchez, Mississippi, August 18, 1847. The scent of magnolia drifted through the open windows of the Whitmore dining room, and candlelight rested on crystal goblets as if it had trapped fireflies inside them. 12 people sat around the table. Judge Cornelius Whitmore, his wife Margaret, their children, their lifelong certainties, and standing silently between those certainties was one quiet figure, Clara. Clara had spent 11 years in this kitchen. Her hands knew the weight of salt, sugar and pepper, and tonight one more thing, arsenic, beneath her tied apron. Her fingers stayed steady, eyes fixed on the dining room doorway. To them, she was a village woman, a cook, a servant. But on this dark night, she was running the last check of a plan written in silence. Wine reduction over duck, sweet, sharp, and just metallic enough to hide the taste of death. Creamed vegetables, thick white sauce concealing what no one should notice. And on the kitchen shelf, the birthday cake, waiting cold and innocent under unlit candles. The grandfather clock in the parlor struck 7. Each chime hung in the Mississippi air like a funeral bell. In the dining room, laughter rolled, cotton prices, court gossip, the talk of a new carriage. Judge Whitmore raised his third glass, to family, to prosperity, to the natural order of things. His tongue was heavy and he thought it was the wine. Clara knew better. The calculation was exact. Her arrival at this house had been a wound that never closed. The New Orleans slave market, the sale of her 2 small daughters, Grace and Patience, torn apart like sacks of grain. Here, in the judge's home, she became the good cook, her silence praised as obedience. Tonight, that same silence was her final seasoning. "Pass the duck, would you?" Margaret said. The plate made its rounds. Little Emma, just 6, pushed her vegetables around with a fork. "These taste funny, grandmother." "Nonsense," Margaret smiled. "Clara's cooking is above reproach." Clara watched, spoons rising. Sips taken, small smiles forming. The dosage was perfect, enough to kill. Not enough to warn. Too much, and bitterness would betray her. Too little, and the story would be incomplete. 3 months of gathering, counting, storing the poison inside a hollow gourd, all for this single supper. At 7:20, Emma's cheeks flushed red. By 7:32, one of the sons-in-law was sweating, his gut twisting in acid pain. James Whitmore, the eldest son, dabbed his forehead and forced a laugh. "Must be the wine. Too generous tonight, father." A ripple of laughter followed, and the clock consumed another minute. Beyond the door, water boiled in the kitchen. But under the hiss was another sound, a faint metallic tang only Clara could sense. For a heartbeat, she lifted her eyes to the ceiling and silently recited a line she had once whispered beneath the oak tree to others like her. "Knowledge is the only thing they cannot sell." Pretty one, Margaret rang the bell, a soft silver ting. "Clara." "More sauce." Clara entered, calm and steady, set down the bowl, and stirred one slow circle at the center of the dish. For a fleeting second, the surface of the wine shimmered as though it took a breath. Then she stepped back. 45. Emma's fork clattered onto her plate, scattering vegetables across the linen. A small gulp. Then vomit, sharp, hot, and immediate. Her mother rushed to her, only for her own knees to give way. The judge tried to stand, chair scraping behind him, face darkening purple, hands clawing at his throat. "The food," someone gasped. "We've been—" Clara released the door frame. She didn't disappear, and she simply stepped out of their sight. In the kitchen's half-light, a single shaft of moonlight cut through the window, and she walked right into it. Inside, the dominoes began to fall. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered, screams collided with prayers. James dragged himself toward the door, his chest scraping across the polished floor. The judge's head fell forward into his birthday cake, frosting smeared, candles unlit. But the harshest image of all wasn't the dying. It was the stillness of those who could have helped but didn't. From the parlor to the slave quarters, the sound traveled. Bells, screams, crashing wood. The footman folded laundry before investigating. The stable boy saw a shadow moving down the river path carrying a bundle, and said nothing until morning. By 8 call, The air in the dining room had changed. The magnolia's sweetness gave way to the sour stench of fear. The polished oak floors glistened with sweat and bile. Outside, lamplight still glowed from the slave cabins. Inside, no one left to fetch the doctor. The horror of arsenic wasn't death. It was the waiting. It worked like music. Nausea, cramps, choking, silence. Each note perfectly timed. The grandfather clock kept striking, sealing every second like a witness signing its name. In the kitchen, Clara washed her hands in the basin, the flour rinsing clean from her fingers. She checked the hidden seam of her apron, forged papers. 37, a small rosary she had never used for prayer but for performance. The back door opened to the damp air, the smell of wet earth, of river water, of freedom waiting. Inside, Margaret still fought for breath, ringing the bell again. A desperate, hollow chime. The kitchen heard metal clinks, but no footsteps answered. A child foamed at the mouth. Another collapsed. The judge's fading eyes locked onto the portrait of his father on the wall. Another plantation owner who had also died suddenly at dinner 20 years before. Had that been illness? Or another ladle of justice long forgotten? Didi, the clock swallowed. Its next minute, Clara slung her bundle over her shoulder and stepped onto the path toward the river. The full moon painted the forest in chalk-white lines. She knew every duress. The years of pretending to gather herbs had mapped this route in her bones. Behind her, the house filled with screams fading into wet silence. For a moment, she stopped. Grace and patience flickered in her mind. The small fingers, the crooked pinky. She wetted her lips, swallowed the metallic ghost of guilt, and kept walking. By 8:15, the Whitmore dining room had become a battlefield where the enemy was invisible. The parlor clock kept pushing time forward, relentless and cold. The kitchen fire had gone out. Through the open windows, Magnolia lingered like the ghost of a prayer. And beyond the cotton fields, the river drew a long, deep breath, as if it already knew, tonight, judgment would not be held in court. It would be carried out upon the water. The year was 1836, 11 years before the poison supper. The auction block in New Orleans shimmered under the southern sun, bare wood, brass bells, and the hum of numbers. Buyers in linen suits fanned themselves, bidding for people as though they were cattle. The middle of it stood Clara, 19 years old, wrists bound with coarse rope, two small girls clutching at her skirt. Lot 47, called the auctioneer. Healthy field woman with 2 pickaninnies. Fine stock. Trained in house service. The bidding was quick. The Hendersons, the Beauregards, the Whitmores, all familiar names in the slave markets. A nod, a scribbled signature, and it was done. Clara was sold north to Adams County. Her daughters split and resold. Within the hour, Grace to a sugar plantation. Near Baton Rouge, Patience to a cotton estate 2 counties. Away. 3 names inked on 3 bills of sale. 1 family dismembered by commerce. That night in the holding shed, Clara pressed her forehead to the wooden wall and made no sound. She had learned that silence was safer than prayer, but in her heart something calcified. A plan that would take years to ripen. The house on the hill Judge Cornelius Whitmore's plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres. The mansion was a 2-story colossus of whitewashed brick, flanked by magnolia trees and the smell of river mud. 47 enslaved people maintained it, some in the fields, others inside, where life was cleaner but no kinder. Clara was assigned to the kitchen, beneath the supervision of Miss Margaret Whitmore, who insisted that a good servant should be invisible but indispensable. Clara learned fast how to roast duck until the skin crisped like parchment, how to make sauces shine, how to fold napkins in shapes that pleased dinner guests. Invisibility became her art. She learned more than recipes. When the family doctor, Dr. Edmund Hayes, visited, she stood in the corner pretending not to listen. He talked about arsenic, mercury, laudanum, poisons and medicines differing only in dose. She memorized everything. Knowledge she understood was a sharper weapon than any knife. Letters never sent. Every spring, when the traders came through town, Clara slipped them questions. Did you pass the Beauregard place? Ever see a girl named Patience, 5 years old, crooked pinky? You been to Baton Rouge? Grace Henderson, light-skinned, little scar on her cheek. Sometimes a traitor remembered, sometimes he didn't. Once one laughed. "Plenty of girls named Grace," he said. "They all grow up into trouble?" Clara smiled then, polite and invisible. Inside, she carved the man's name into memory like a grave marker. The year of small beginnings, by 1846, 11 years into her bondage, the household had grown careless with familiarity. Margaret trusted her completely. "Our Clara," she'd tell guests, "has hands blessed by the Lord." The judge boasted that even the governor admired his table. That year, the rats came. Dozens of them, gnawing the grain sacks in the storehouse. Margaret sent Clara to buy poison from the general store in Natchez. "Ask for the fine white powder. Tell them it's for vermin," she instructed. The merchant wrapped it in brown paper without question. "Keep it away from the children," he warned. Clara nodded, tucking the packet into her apron. The first rat died within an hour. The second took longer. She measured, observed, noted. Soon she knew how much to kill, and how much merely to make one sick. It was the beginning of her education. The whispered school at night. Beneath the great oak behind the slave quarters, Clara gathered a few trusted souls. Old Moses, the blacksmith missing 3 fingers, Ruth, the head housemaid, 2 children who still believed learning might someday matter. She drew letters in flowers spread on a board. A, B, then she whispered words she'd memorized from the judge's discarded newspapers. Freedom, justice, patience, grace. Knowledge, she told them, is the only thing they can't sell. Her secret school became legend in whispers. The teaching tree, they called it. No one spoke of it where white ears could hear. The breaking point, August 1847, arrived with a heat so thick, the air felt chewable. The judge planned his birthday feast, a grand affair for family and friends. Clara cooked, silent as always. But that morning she overheard a conversation through the parlor door. Margaret was speaking to a guest about a sale. "We've had that cook too long," she said. "She's grown proud. Perhaps it's time to sell her to Belmont Estate. They pay well for trained hands, Belmont." Another name on her daughter's trail, a name that triggered something final in her chest. If they meant to sell her, they would first eat her farewell. That evening, as the judge's children arrived from Jackson and Baton Rouge, as laughter filled the great house, Clara opened her hidden gourd of collected arsenic and poured a final measure, carefully, reverently, as though baptizing each spoonful. Preparation for a feast, she worked with a serenity that frightened even herself. Duck, roasted to golden perfection. Sauce simmered until it gleamed like dark. Wine vegetables creamed, seasoned, and dusted with invisible death. Cake frosted with sweetness and silence. In her mind, she saw 2 faces, Grace and Patience, somewhere out there, maybe still alive. Every stir of her spoon whispered their names. When the clock struck 7 and she stood in the doorway between kitchen and dining room, hands folded over her apron, she was no longer a cook. She was the judge, and supper was her verdict. The sun had long bled into the Mississippi horizon when the Whitmore mansion came alive with celebration. Candles burned low in silver holders, their light flickering over portraits of ancestors who watched from the walls like silent jurors. Outside, the cicadas screamed. Inside, the family feasted. In the doorway stood Clara, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly over her apron, the very picture of obedience. But inside her chest, her heart beat like a war drum. The toast judge Cornelius Whitmore rose to speak, his voice thick with brandy and pride. "To family," he said, raising his glass. "To prosperity. To the natural order of things." 12 glasses lifted, catching candlelight like captured fireflies. Crimson wine swirled, dark, beautiful, fatal. As they drank, Clara's gaze followed every swallow. Margaret dabbed her lips delicately. The sons exchanged jokes about cotton yields. Little Emma sipped her sweetened milk, pouting at the vegetables she didn't like. Clara's fingertips dug into the doorframe. She had waited 11 years for this. The first sign at 7:43 p.m. The first cough echoed through the dining room. "Are you well, dear?" Margaret asked her husband. The judge waved her off. "Just the heat," he said. "This damned humidity." But a shadow passed across his face, red deepening to purple. Next came Emma. She whined softly, pushing her plate away. These taste funny. Grandmother, Margaret smiled indulgently. Nonsense, darling. Clara's cooking is above reproach. Emma's small hand trembled as she lifted her fork again. Moments later, she vomited across the tablecloth. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. The judge tried to stand, but the floor tilted beneath him. His glass shattered against the floorboards. One by one, the family began to cough, gag, scream. The food. Someone cried, "We've been poisoned." The word spread like fire, bouncing off the polished walls. All eyes turned to the kitchen doorway, but Clara was gone. The house descends. The next 15 minutes were chaos. Margaret shrieked for help, slamming her hand on the silver bell that summoned servants. Its clear tone cut through the night. Sharp, relentless, desperate. But no one came. In the kitchen, the enslaved staff froze at the sound. 6 of them. Ruth, Samuel, Letty, old Moses, and 2 boys barely old enough to shave, exchanged silent looks. Then they returned to their work. Ruth picked up a dish towel. "Keep washing," she whispered. "Let them ring," old Moses nodded slowly. "Let them face the Lord themselves." The diary of Thomas Apprentice in 1887, 40 years later. The man named Thomas Apprentice, once the Whitmore's stable boy, wrote in his old age, "I could have run for the doctor. God knows I could have. But I thought of my sister. Sold away when the judge needed quick money. I thought of the backs he broke. The babies buried without names. So I stood there and watched." That single confession became the only first-hand testimony ever recorded of that night. A witness not to the crime, but to the silence that followed it. The orchestration of death by 8:15. The dining room resembled a battlefield. Bodies convulsed in rhythm, some gasping, others already still. The polished oak floor slickened with spilled wine and worse. The once sweet aroma of roasted duck had curdled into the stench of bile and fear. The judge clawed at the tablecloth, dragging dishes down in a clatter of china. His eldest son James tried to speak, to command, to curse, but the words drowned in his throat. In his final moments of clarity, Cornelius Whitmore looked toward the mantel, where his father's portrait hung in oil and gilt frame. A realization crawled across his dying face. His father had died suddenly at dinner, 20 years earlier. Stomach cramps. They'd said a family curse, they'd whispered, or perhaps a legacy. The house that watched out in the quarters. The enslaved families heard the screams drift across the fields, sharp at first, then fading to groans. Some mothers covered their children's ears. Others simply sat in silence, heads bowed, listening as history took a breath and turned over. Old Moses lit his pipe, watching the main house windows flicker with candlelight and chaos. He exhaled smoke like a benediction. "Judgment comes slow," he murmured. "But it comes." In the big house, the last to die was Margaret Whitmore. Even as the poison burned her insides, she dragged herself toward the service bell. The polished silver handle cold beneath her hand, she rang it one final time. A clear, desperate chime that echoed through the halls and out the open windows. The sound reached the kitchen. No one moved. The kitchen's calm Clara had planned everything, even her absence. She'd left the doors unlatched and the windows open, as if inviting the night to witness what justice looked like when served hot. The leftover sauce simmered quietly on the stove. The cake waited on the counter, its sugar dusting hiding a deathly glitter. The kitchen smelled of smoke and magnolia, sweetness masking sin. When the bell finally fell silent, Ruth whispered, "It's done." Samuel crossed himself. "God forgive her." Old Moses shook his head. "No, God should be taking notes." The river path down by the river. Moonlight pooled on the muddy banks. Clara moved through the reeds like smoke. Her bundle was light. Forged papers. $37 and a single magnolia petal pressed between Bible pages. Behind her, the plantation roared with confusion. The sound of chairs crashing, prayers shouted, and the ticking of the grandfather clock counting down the last breaths of the Whitmore line. She didn't look back. Freedom was a direction, not a destination. The river whispered as it met her ankles. Cool and black as ink, Clara took one steady breath and stepped in. The house at midnight by 11:47 p.m. 12 members of the Whitmore family lay dead. their feast half-eaten, the cake uncut, the candles melted into wax puddles. The mansion was silent except for the clock and the flies, and somewhere in the darkness between the Mississippi and the stars, Clara moved north, following invisible maps drawn in whispers and faith. The kitchen that had once been her prison had become her battlefield, and every pot, every ladle, every grain of salt had been her weapon. Justice had a flavor that night, sweet, metallic and final. The night that had begun with laughter ended in silence thick enough to taste. By the time the sun's first light reached the Whitmore Plantation, the great house on the hill looked less like a monument and more like a mausoleum. Dew clung to the grass like cold sweat. The cicadas had gone quiet, replaced by the distant lowing of cattle and the sound of the Mississippi breathing through the trees. Inside, the dining room was frozen in the moment of its own destruction. 12 bodies sat or sprawled where death had found them. Chairs overturned, napkins twisted in fists, the cake untouched and drooping. The air was heavy with the mixed scents of magnolia, wine, and decay. Outside in the slave quarters, no one slept. They had waited in the dark, every creak of the big house echoing across the fields like thunder. Now the roosters crowed, the same sound that marked every morning, but this one carried something new in it. Something like freedom and something like fear. The morning after Ruth, the head housemaid, was the first to move. Her back ached from a night of stillness. Her heart ached from knowing what silence cost. She opened the door of her cabin and looked toward the mansion. The windows were black and still. No one had lit the parlor lamps. No smoke curled from the chimney. It was 5:30 a.m., and no breakfast orders had come. Behind her, old Moses hobbled out, leaning on his cane. His voice was low, careful. "They ain't rang the bell since midnight," Ruth nodded. "Then maybe they won't again." By 6 o'clock, the word had spread through the quarters. The big house is quiet. No one dared approach it yet. They went about their chores in eerie mimicry, carrying buckets, feeding animals, sweeping porches. The performance of servitude continued because it was safer than truth. The first discovery at 7. The smell reached them, not the sweet decay of animals, but the heavy chemical rot of human bodies. It seeped through the morning air, mingling with honeysuckle and wood smoke. A field hand named Jupiter finally broke. He wiped sweat from his brow and said what everyone thought. "Somebody gotta go see," Ruth volunteered. Her authority, built from years of running the household, still held weight even now, when no master remained to give orders. She took Letty, the youngest kitchen girl, and together they climbed the path toward the mansion. The front door was ajar. Inside, the stillness was unbearable. Flies had already found the feast. Their buzzing filled the air like a hymn sung by demons. Ruth covered her mouth with her apron. Letty gagged. The judge lay face down in the remains of his birthday cake. Margaret was collapsed beside the bell pull, its silver handle still warm from her grip. The children were slumped over their plates, eyes glazed and glassy. Letty whispered, "Lord have mercy." Ruth lowered her voice, cold and practical. "Mercy came last night. What's left is work." They closed the parlor doors and locked them from the inside before going back out through the kitchen. The lie was already forming in Ruth's mind. Neat, precise, like Clara had taught her. "They got sick at supper," she rehearsed aloud. "We tried to help, but it came too fast. Maybe bad meat, maybe the wine. Clara, she's gone. Sold 2 weeks ago. Belmont Estate." By the time she reached the quarters again, the story was clean. She told it once, slowly, to everyone gathered, her eyes fierce as she spoke. If they ask, that's what happened. No mention of Clara, no talk of poison. We played dumb like always. Samuel the blacksmith crossed his arms. And if they don't believe it? Ruth's jaw tightened. Then we die together, but not for the truth. For the lie that keeps us free. The sheriff arrives at 9:43. The sound of hooves broke the strange peace. A cloud of dust rolled down the main road, and out of it emerged Sheriff William Donovan. His coat unbuttoned, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. 2 deputies and the county coroner, Dr. Marcus Webb, followed behind. Ruth met them at the front door, wiping her eyes raw with onion juice for the right amount of redness. "It happened so fast, Sheriff," she sobbed. "They was fine, and then they started falling. We couldn't do nothing." Dr. Webb went straight to work, his instruments gleaming in the dim light. He examined each body carefully, making notes with clinical detachment. Skin flushed cherry red, pupils contracted, foam around lips. His conclusion came within minutes. Arsenic poisoning, but that was only the beginning. The interrogations, Donovan's eyes were sharp. His tone measured. Who prepared the meal? Ruth didn't flinch, we all did. Clara made the sauces before she left, but I finished the duck. Samuel carved it. Letty handled the vegetables. It was a perfect half-truth. Broad enough to include everyone. Specific enough to end the questioning. The sheriff frowned. This Clara, where is she now? Ruth hesitated just long enough to seem uncertain. Georgia, sir. Sold 2 weeks ago to Belmont Estate. Judge had her bill of sale signed and everything. That was another lie, but a good one. Because at dawn, Ruth had already forged the document using the judge's stationery and signature she'd practiced copying for months under Clara's teaching. Coffee grounds darkened the ink. A little smoke aged the paper. By the time Donovan saw it, it looked older than the truth. Dr. Webb's observation. While the sheriff questioned the staff, Dr. Webb noticed a small detail others missed. A single magnolia petal on the kitchen floor. Still fresh. There were no magnolia trees near the kitchen. Only by the riverbank. He wrote it in his notes, but said nothing yet. His medical mind was practical, but curiosity already gnawed at him. Something about this poisoning felt too exact, too deliberate for accident, too elegant for madness. The family dead within a precise span of hours. The symptoms identical. It was chemistry, not chaos. The search by noon. Donovan ordered the entire property searched. Cabins, stables, outbuildings. Nothing was left untouched. The enslaved workers stood quietly in lines as strangers rifled through their meager possessions. Patched clothes, cornhusk mattresses, a few coins. What the searchers didn't find was more telling than what they did. No notes, no journals, no traces of the secret school under the teaching tree, because Ruth and the others had already burned it all at 3 a.m. A pyre of papers and memories that sent up a brief column of smoke. Unnoticed in the dark, when the deputies reported back empty-handed, the sheriff's frustration showed. Someone in this yard knows what happened, he said, and someone helped her. But the faces before him were masks carved from endurance. Blank, steady, unreadable. Generations of survival had taught them how to hide behind silence. A community of witnesses that night. After the sheriff and coroner left to report back to Natchez, the quarters came alive again. Softly, cautiously, Ruth gathered them inside her cabin, the same way Clara once had under the oak tree. We tell it again, she said. Same words, same tone. If they split us up tomorrow, we sound like one voice. They recited the story until it fit like a hymn. The family ate dinner. They got sick. We tried to help. Clara was gone. The Lord's will be done. When they finished, old Moses lifted his cracked voice in prayer. Lord, we pray for the souls of the departed, he said. May they find the peace in death they never gave in life. A quiet amen rolled through the room. Soft, defiant, unbroken. Fear spreads beyond the hill by the next morning. The news had traveled downriver. The Natchez Gazette printed the headline, 12 dead at Whitmore Estate. Suspected poisoning by Negro cook. White households across Mississippi locked their pantries and dismissed their servants. Some made them taste each dish before serving. Others refused to eat anything they hadn't cooked themselves. Fear moved faster than any fugitive ever could. In kitchens from Jackson to Baton Rouge, silver spoons trembled in pale hands. The unfinished truth. The Whitmore Plantation was officially closed for investigation. The bodies were buried under marble headstones. The inscriptions blaming tainted wine. The enslaved workers remained in limbo, belonging to no living master, property of a ghost in a courthouse, but they knew better. They had seen the truth and built their freedom on its ashes. That night, under the same oak tree where Clara had once drawn letters in flower, Ruth whispered to the wind, "She's free now, and we are too, in our own way." Old Moses nodded, pipe glowing faintly in the dark. "The world won't remember her right," he said. "They never do," Ruth smiled faintly. "Then we'll remember her wrong on purpose, so she stays alive." The cicadas began to sing again, their song weaving through the humid air like a resurrection. The Whitmore plantation still stood on its hill, but something fundamental had shifted. The balance had tilted. The fear had changed sides. And somewhere far down the Mississippi, a woman with a bundle and $37 was already following the river's curve toward freedom, leaving behind not a massacre, but a message. For 2 days, the Whitmore plantation remained sealed under the heavy hand of law. A guard was stationed at the gate. Flies claimed the dining room as their kingdom. The county courthouse demanded a culprit, and the sheriff promised to bring one before the next Sabbath. The only name that anyone dared whisper was Clara. The birth of a legend by the time the Natchez Gazette printed its second edition, Clara was already more myth than woman. They called her the poison cook, the devil's maid, the Magnolia widow. Each tavern tale exaggerated her. Some said she'd boiled frogs for practice. Others that she'd learned her craft from Haitian sorcerers no one spoke. Of the auction block or the daughters torn from her, no one spoke of a woman who'd spent 11 years learning science beneath contempt. In the eyes of Mississippi, Clara wasn't a survivor. She was a monster who had dared to understand chemistry. Sheriff Donovan's hunt sheriff, William Donovan, had never lost a fugitive before, and he refused to start with a cook. He traced her supposed sale papers to the Belmont estate, but their overseer swore no such woman had arrived. The judge never sent no cook here, he said, and if he did, we'd have noticed her. Donovan's jaw clenched. He rode back to the Whitmore property, the forged sale document in his pocket. He read it over and over again. Same ink, same signature. Perfect down to the loops of the W. Too perfect. He muttered under his breath. Whoever wrote this knew exactly what they were doing. That night, he burned the paper in his office fireplace, but the smoke left a scent of magnolia. Dr. Webb's theory: while the sheriff hunted shadows, Dr. Marcus Webb studied the bodies. He dissected tissue samples, mixed reagents, and tested residues. Arsenic glittered beneath his microscope like powdered stars. But what unsettled him wasn't the presence of poison. It was the precision. Every dose identical, he told his assistant, measured to the grain. This wasn't chance or panic. It was design. He wrote to the medical college in New Orleans describing the case, omitting names but not details. His letter, published months later, became the first recorded forensic study of arsenic poisoning in the South. He ended it with one haunting sentence. The hand that mixed these portions understood mercy as much as murder. No. The river trailed downriver, the Mississippi was in flood. Barges drifted like sleeping beasts, and at night the fog rose so thick, a lantern's light could vanish in arm's reach. Somewhere within that fog, Clara walked. She followed the back paths where fugitives whispered maps, creeks instead of roads, moss instead of compasses, at the town of St. Joseph. A ferryman remembered a woman in a blue shawl paying with gold coins stamped 1835. Far too fine for a servant. She didn't talk much, he told the sheriff later. Said she was heading to New Orleans. Said she had daughters waiting. Donovan marked the spot on his map. He didn't know that Clara had already crossed into Louisiana by then. Her name traded among abolitionists like a prayer. The panic in Natchez within weeks. The Whitmore deaths had rippled outward. Planters dismissed their cooks. Families forced servants to eat from each dish first. Pharmacies stopped selling arsenic without a doctor's note. At church gatherings, women whispered of a Negro curse. Preachers thundered that the devil had taken female form. But in the quarters, people whispered a different gospel. She did it clean. She walked away. She ain't no devil. She's justice with a spoon. Ruth kept that version alive. Whenever someone faltered, afraid of questioning too loud, she'd remind them. They took her children. She took their peace. 6 the federal agents by winter. The story had reached Washington. 12 white deaths in one night couldn't be ignored. The U.S. Marshal's Office dispatched Agent Henry Lowell, a former Pinkerton man with a reputation for tracking runaways across 3 states. Lowell was no believer in spirits. He was a man of facts, and he collected them ruthlessly. He interviewed every hand on the Whitmore property, every merchant within 20 miles, every ferryman on the river. When he reached Ruth, she offered him the same rehearsed lie. Sold to Belmont Estate, sir. Ain't seen her since, but Lowell saw the flicker in her eyes, pride disguised as grief. He knew the look. He'd seen it in abolition safe houses from Ohio to Kansas. Still, without proof, he could do nothing. He filed his report. Subject likely dead or escaped north via river network. Locals idolize her as avenger. Recommend case closure. The letter that never reached in the attic of the Whitmore house long after investigators had gone. Dr. Webb found a folded sheet wedged beneath the floorboards. It was written in neat cursive. The ink faded to brown. To whomever finds this, I do not fear God's judgment. Only man's. I fed them what they fed me for years, silence and sorrow. Seasoned with patience. Tell my daughters their mother didn't run. She served her last meal proper. CD. The initials could have been anyone's, but Webb knew better. He kept the note hidden for 20 years, then donated it anonymously to the university archive, where it slept until historians rediscovered it in 1902. 8. The Divide Mississippi split itself around her ghost. To the white landowners, Clara became a cautionary tale. Proof that knowledge in the wrong hands was rebellion. To the enslaved and freed alike, she became a psalm. Field songs carried her name across counties. Clara cooked the devil's feast, fed him what he'd fed the least. River took her, left no bone. Justice walking all alone. For every preacher who damned her, 100 whispered prayers raised her. And somewhere north of Vicksburg, a woman fitting her description took work as a herbalist, healing sick children with the same measured precision she'd once used for poison. The investigator's nightmare. Years later, Sheriff Donovan retired, but the case refused to die. He dreamed of magnolia petals drifting across a table, of candles snuffing out one by one. Sometimes in his dreams, Clara stood behind him in that same blue shawl. You found what you were looking for? She'd ask. I found 12 graves, he'd say. Then you were counting the wrong dead. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the scent of arsenic and magnolia thick in his throat. The New Science by 1850, medical journals across the country cited the Whitmore. Poisoning as a turning point in forensic toxicology. Young chemists built arsenic detection tests in her shadow. Doctors warned households to lock their apothecaries. Professors lectured about the dangers of unsupervised intellect, but none spoke her name. Clara had vanished not only from the records, but from the very comfort of memory, replaced by a ghost of fear and fascination. Levin, Ruth's final testimony in 863. As the Union Army moved through Mississippi, an old woman named Ruth approached a camp of colored soldiers. She carried a Bible. Frayed at the edges and inside it, a pressed magnolia petal. To a young corporal, she said, "Tell your papers this, the war didn't start with cannons. It started in a kitchen. Started when one woman stopped praying and started measuring." The corporal, not understanding the weight of her words, nodded and wrote it down. The note survived in regimental archives, unsigned, undated, but echoing across time. The truth that survived history remembered Clara Doyle, the woman once bought for $30, as both witch and martyr, depending on who told it. But among the descendants of those who'd lived on the Whitmore land, her name passed down like inheritance. Each year, on the anniversary of the poisoning, they lit a candle and placed a single magnolia petal beside it, not to celebrate death, but to remember the moment one woman bent the laws of power with the tools she was given. They didn't call it murder, they called it balance. The river carried her faster than memory could follow. By the time the first posters went up, wanted Clara Doyle, Negro woman, suspected in mass murder, she had already become something else. Not a fugitive, not a cook, not a mother. She was an idea adrift on the Mississippi, moving with the current, breathing in silence, and learning what it meant to exist without chains. The river that remembers, the Mississippi, was swollen that year, spilling over its banks, swallowing fields and fences alike. It was a dangerous time to travel, but danger had always been Clara's companion. Each bend in the river offered new disguises, fog for a veil, driftwood for company, stars for direction. She moved by night, sleeping by day in hollowed trees or abandoned river shacks. Her bundle had grown lighter. One dress, a loaf of bread, the forged papers, and the Bible that still carried the pressed magnolia petal. Every evening, she whispered to the river as though it were an old friend, "Carry me far enough that my sins grow small behind me." "Sometimes," the current answered, not in words but in the soft lap of water against the boat. By the time she reached Vicksburg, 3 days later, she was no longer Clara Doyle. She was Mary Wren, widow of a sailor lost to the Gulf storms, at least. That's what her papers said. The city of smoke and sin, Vicksburg, in 1872, was a scar dressed in commerce. The war had ended, but the smell of gunpowder still haunted the soil. Factories coughed black smoke into the air. Freedmen in patched coats walked beside ex-Confederate soldiers who pretended not to see them. Mary Wren rented a corner in a boarding house on Clay Street. 1 bed, 1 window, and a wash basin that leaked when it rained. She found work in a small apothecary, run by Dr. Amos Heller, a kind man whose hands trembled from age. He hired her to grind herbs and mix tonics. Her precision impressed him. "You've a steady hand," he said. Mary smiled faintly. "It's steady because it remembers too much." In the quiet hours after the shop closed, she copied recipes into her own small notebook. Mixtures of valerian, foxglove, camphor. Medicines, poisons, and everything between. The return of rumors, but even rivers can't bury a story. By summer, talk of the poison cook had reached Vicksburg. Men told the tale in saloons, how she'd served arsenic in silver, how her eyes had glowed like lamps before the deed. One night, a drunkard stumbled into the apothecary, laughing. "You hear about that witch from Whitmore's place? They say she still walks the river banks at night with a ladle made of bone." Mary froze, pestle in hand. The laughter felt like thunder. She forced herself to smile. "Folk will believe anything if it helps them sleep." The man squinted. "You talk like you knew her." "I knew a lot of women blamed for things they didn't do," she replied, and sent him on his way. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the river's faint shimmer beyond the rooftops. The world would never forget Clara Doyle, but it had already forgotten the reason she existed. The hidden letters in a drawer beneath her bed. Mary kept a stack of letters she never sent. Each one began the same way. "My dearest Ruth, if you are still on that land, I hope the magnolias bloom for you this spring." She wrote about the river, the city, the people who looked at her and saw nothing dangerous. She wrote about the children who came to the apothecary with coughs and fevers, and how she healed them without charging their mothers. But she never dared send them north. Letters could be intercepted. Names traced, lives ended. So she folded each one, pressed it flat, and burned it in a small iron bowl by the window, the smoke rising like prayer. The stranger at the door one autumn morning, a man appeared at the shop. He was tall, dressed in a Union officer's coat gone threadbare with time. His left hand was missing 3 fingers. "Looking for a woman," he said. "Name of Clara Doyle." Dr. Heller blinked. "We've no one by that name." The man smiled, but not kindly. "Funny thing, they say she's a healer now. Hides behind false names." Mary stood at the back, grinding herbs, her breath shallow. The pestle didn't tremble. She spoke without turning. "You'll find no murderers here, sir. Only people trying to forget." The man studied her a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he tipped his hat. "If you see her, tell her the river still whispers her name." When he was gone, Mary found her hands shaking. She dropped the mortar. The sound cracked through the shop like a gunshot. Dr. Heller rushed in. "Are you all right?" She forced a nod. "Just clumsy, doctor. Some ghost stepped on my shadow, that's all." 6. The New Gospel. In the months that followed, the apothecary became something else. People came not just for medicine, but for counsel. Freedmen, widows, soldiers, all carrying invisible wounds. Mary treated them with herbs in silence, listening more than speaking. To those who trusted her enough to ask about the stories, she gave one truth, whispered like scripture: no one is born wicked. The world just gives some of us fewer choices. And those words spread. By the next spring, travelers passing through Vicksburg spoke of a saint in the smoke, a woman who healed with her eyes closed, who never asked for names, who could tell if you lied just by touching your wrist. She had become something larger again. Not Clara, not Mary. Something between myth and mercy. The visit from the past it was the night of the first flood in April 1873 when a knock came on her door. When she opened it, an older woman stood there, soaked from the rain. It took only a heartbeat for recognition to bloom. "Ruth," Clara whispered. They embraced in silence. The years between them melted into salt and tears. Ruth spoke first. "The land's gone. Yankees took it. The grave's still there, though. I buried your Bible under the big oak," Clara smiled softly. "Then the trees got good roots. They talked through the night of freedom, of ghosts of the others who'd made it north or didn't. By dawn, Ruth was gone again, leaving only a magnolia petal on the windowsill. It stayed there until the next flood washed it away. The end of the river, when Dr. Heller died that winter, Mary took over the apothecary. Her hair had silvered, her hands still steady. She treated every child, every soldier, every soul who walked through the door, never asking for money, never turning anyone away. On the last page of her hidden journal, she wrote, "Names are weights, and I have carried too many. When I die, bury me by the river with no marker. Let the current remember what I was." In 1881, a flood swept through Vicksburg. The apothecary was destroyed. Among the wreckage, rescuers found a small wooden box wrapped in oilskin. Inside, dried herbs, an empty vial labeled Justice, and a single magnolia petal pressed flat between Bible pages. The legend grows. After her death, stories multiplied. Some said she'd fled north again. Others claimed she'd turned into the river itself, her soul whispering through the reeds whenever injustice rose. Children in Mississippi grew up hearing of the Magnolia Woman, who punished cruelty with invisible poisons and healed those who suffered under it. To some, she was a demon. To others, a saint to the river. She was memory made eternal. The final word a century later. Historians uncovered fragments of Dr. Webb's notes, the unsent letters, and that small journal. They pieced together her life with awe and unease, arguing whether she was villain, victim, or visionary. But in one fragile line written in faded brown ink, her voice still lived. "I was never trying to destroy the world, I was just trying to make it remember." By the time the century turned, Clara Doyle no longer belonged to history books or police reports. She belonged to whispers. In parlors, on porches, and in plantation ruins swallowed by ivy. Her name survived like smoke trapped in wood. People called her many things: the poison cook, the river witch, the Magnolia Woman, but no one said her name without lowering their voice. The return of the story in the 1900s. Sharecroppers still working Mississippi soil passed her story from mouth to mouth. Old women told it to their grandchildren by candlelight, of a cook who'd once fed justice to her masters, spoon by spoon, until even the river bowed to her will. "They say she still walked them banks at night," one grandmother whispered, "looking for folks that treat others the way them Whitmores did. She don't use poison no more, just whispers your name into the wind. And by morning you cough up truth till it kills you." Children trembled and smiled, because the story wasn't meant to scare them. It was meant to remind them. There had been a woman who fought back with the only weapon she had: knowledge. The house that wouldn't stay quiet, the Whitmore Plantation house, what remained of it, was sold and resold a dozen times in 50 years. No owner lasted long. At night, the grand dining room, boarded, nailed, forgotten, filled with sounds, the scrape of chairs, the soft ring of silverware. Once, a caretaker swore he heard a woman humming in the kitchen, low and rhythmic, followed by the faint scent of magnolia and something sharper, metallic. When he opened the door, there was nothing but dust and a broken wine glass on the floor. Local folks stopped cutting through the property after dark. Preachers said it was cursed ground, but those who knew the real story said, "It ain't cursed. It's remembering." 3. Songs by the Firelight. In 1923, a field recording team from New Orleans captured a collection of spirituals sung by freedmen descendants. One track, labeled simply "The Woman at the River," told her story in mournful rhythm. She stirred the storm in the pot that night. Silver spoon and holy light, fed them lies, fed them sin, washed her hands. The river took her in. The researchers thought it was metaphor, a folktale about divine vengeance. But for the singers, it was history coded in melody, safe enough to sing when truth was still dangerous. They sang not of murder, but of justice that finally learned to speak. The northern echo far north in Chicago, in the kitchen of a small boarding house, an elderly black woman named Martha Washington once trained her apprentices to cook with intention. She never mentioned Mississippi, but every dish she prepared began with a whisper and ended with a pause, as if she were listening for someone standing behind her. People said she could tell when a lie entered her kitchen, that she'd stop stirring, look up slowly and say, "You best fix your words before you fix your plate." She died in 1885. Her obituary small and forgettable, except for the last line, "Beloved teacher." Known for her magnolia perfume. By the 1930s, younger cooks told each other, Martha wasn't Martha. That was her, the Magnolia Woman, hiding in plain sight. The historian's discovery in 1938, a young historian named Dr. Lena Barrow from Howard University stumbled across the old sheriff's report in the Adams County archives. The words, "Case closed, body recovered," caught her attention. But so did the inconsistencies. The corpse listed as Clara was missing the telltale hand scars described. In earlier witness statements, at Barrow's eye, curiosity turned into obsession. She followed fragments. A forged bill of sale, a burned journal, a missing ledger. When she traced the story north, she found letters written by two black teachers in Ontario, Grace and Patience Freeman, both signed with a curious phrase, "Your daughter's in freedom." Barrow published her findings in a small academic paper titled The Cook Who Vanished. Most white historians ignored it, but in black colleges across America, her words ignited awe. For the first time, Clara Doyle was spoken of not as a criminal, but as a scientist, strategist, and mother who used the tools denied her to rewrite the power between master and slave. The ghost on the water fishermen along the Ohio River told a different version. On foggy nights, they swore they saw a woman walking across the shallows, holding a ladle that shimmered like silver. She never looked back, they said, just vanished into mist when the church bells rang. A captain from Cincinnati claimed his boat lantern went out 3 times while crossing the same spot. Each time it flickered. He smelled magnolia and heard a woman whisper, "Justice tastes better warm." He never crossed that stretch again. Superstition. Perhaps, or maybe the river remembered her better than history did. The rebirth of a name in the 1960s. During the height of the civil rights movement, Clara's story resurfaced again, this time not as folklore, but as inspiration. A mural painted in Jackson showed her standing by the river, ladle in one hand, Bible in the other, surrounded by magnolia petals. Beneath it, in bold white paint, were the words, "Knowledge is the sharpest blade." Activists adopted her as a symbol, not of revenge, but of awakening, a woman who refused to remain silent, a cook who turned survival into rebellion, and in kitchens and classrooms across the South, mothers began naming their daughters Clara again. For the first time in 100 years, her name was spoken with pride, the voice that wouldn't fade by the late 20th century. The myth had grown too large for a single truth. Writers, filmmakers, and poets all claimed her story, reshaping it for their time. Some called her a witch, others a freedom fighter. In novels, she became an immortal spirit haunting the guilty. In songs, she became a mother whose love could outlast death. Yet every version, no matter how embellished, kept one thread unchanged. The magnolia, always the scent of magnolia before justice arrived. As one poet wrote, "She didn't vanish, she bloomed." The Forgotten Journal in 2003, workers renovating an old building in Chicago unearthed a hidden compartment behind a crumbling fireplace. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather journal. Its pages were brittle, but the handwriting matched samples of the original Whitmore case. The final entry read simply, "I am many names now. I have seen rivers freeze and children read their first words. When they speak mine, I hope they speak softly, not for fear, but for memory, Let them know I was not wicked. I was necessary. The press called it a hoax. But in the South, people didn't need proof. They already knew. The Magnolia lives on even now in quiet Mississippi towns. The legend lingers. Old cooks leave a single petal by their window on stormy nights. Young women carry magnolia pins on their aprons, whispering her name before important choices. In kitchens, that smell of garlic and grease. Over boiling pots and wooden tables, you can still hear her lessons passed down. Stir slow. Watch close. Don't waste what's powerful. The secret ingredient is always intention. Because Clara Doyle, the Magnolia Woman, didn't just poison 12 people. She poisoned an empire's illusion of safety, and in doing so, she fed generations a new recipe, one for resistance, patience, and freedom. The river never forgot her name. Even when its banks changed, when cities rose on its shores, when the last witnesses turned to dust, the water still carried Clara's reflection, scattered into ripples of memory. But the world above forgot to listen. That is, until her blood found its way back home. The descendant in the spring of 1921, a young teacher named Clara. Freeman arrived in Chicago to take a post at a small school for colored children on State Street. Her students called her Miss Clara, unaware that her name had once belonged to fire and thunder. Her mother, Patience Freeman, had chosen it deliberately, not from history books, but from whispered family stories told over candlelight. She wasn't a monster, Patience had told her. She was your grandmother. The world just called her evil because she was smarter than the men who owned her. Clara had grown up hearing fragments, a river, a kitchen, a magnolia tree that bled white flowers even in drought. But in her family, those weren't bedtime tales. They were warnings. Remember what your hands can do. They can feed, they can heal, or they can end. Now, as an adult, she carried that inheritance quietly, in her posture, in her eyes, and in the way her hands never shook, not even under pressure. The boarding house kitchen. The school shared walls with a boarding house run by an old widow named Martha Washington, who taught the young teacher how to cook between lessons. Every evening, they stood side by side in the same kitchen where the air always smelled faintly of magnolia and something deeper, an aroma that clung to the soul. Salt first, Martha would say, not for taste but for control. And stir slow, she'd add, so the food don't forget who's making it. Miss Clara would nod, never realizing until much later that she was learning more than recipes. She was learning the craft of memory. Because Martha was no ordinary cook, she was Clara Doyle, reborn under a name soft enough to survive. Every night after supper, the elder woman would sit by the window and whisper to the river wind outside. Miss Clara thought it was prayer. It wasn't. It was remembrance. The reunion in 1868. 2 women had stood in that same parlor, Grace and Patience Freeman, her long-lost daughters, meeting their mother for the first time in 20 years. The conversation had been gentle, fragile, filled with both forgiveness and unhealed pain. We understand why, Grace had said. But understanding doesn't mean peace. Peace, Clara replied, was never the goal. Freedom was. They stayed for 2 hours. They left before nightfall, but from that day, the bloodline carried 2 things, knowledge and silence. No one in the Freeman family ever forgot what was buried under that name. And when the old woman finally died in 1885, the younger Clara, just a child then, was told only, she cooked like no one else. She never let anyone else stir her pot. The discovery decades later, in 1937, Miss Clara Freeman, now headmistress of the same school, received a package with no return address. Inside was a brittle, leather-bound notebook. Its title page bore a name she'd only heard in whispers. C. Doyle, Recipes and Reflections. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. It wasn't a cookbook, it was a chronicle. Measurements scrawled beside memories. Lists of herbs intertwined with moral lessons. Foxglove, a drop to slow the heart or to save it. Depends who holds the spoon. Remember, precision is power. Power is choice. Never waste what you've suffered. It can be weapon or wisdom. In the final pages, a line written faintly but clearly read, "To my daughters' daughters, teach them what I was not allowed to write. Let no hand starve for knowledge again." The words broke her, because they felt less like history and more like a command. The revival in 1942. During the Second World War, food was rationed. But in Miss Clara's kitchen, there was always enough. She began teaching her students' mothers how to stretch what they had, how to use herbs for health, how to preserve vegetables, how to mix poultices for fever. They thought it was charity, it was legacy. At the end of each class, she made them repeat one phrase. The secret ingredient is always intention. The same words her grandmother, the same woman who once fed arsenic with faith, had spoken under candlelight a century before. The historian returns when Dr. Lena Barrow published her second study on the Magnolia Woman in 1954. She received a letter written in neat, careful handwriting. "You search for her ghost. I carry her blood. She was not what you think, she was what she had to be." It was unsigned, but the postmark read Chicago State Street. Barrow wept when she read it, because it meant the myth had a pulse, still living, still teaching, still stirring. She added a note to the margin of her research. History calls her poisoner, but those who came from her call her teacher. The taste of memory every year. On the anniversary of the Whitmore deaths, Miss Clara would light a single candle in the kitchen and place one magnolia petal beside it. She would prepare the same dish, roasted duck in wine. Reduction, the same recipe written in the notebook, but she would season it differently. No poison, just herbs that healed, mint for calm, basil for courage, thyme for endurance. When the meal was done, she never ate it. She poured it into the river instead, whispering, "This time, may the flavor feed the free." And the final recipe in her final years, Miss Clara wrote her own book. She called it The Hands That Remember. It was part cookbook, part confession, not of crimes, but of inheritances. She wrote, "My grandmother believed that the kitchen was a battlefield disguised as a sanctuary. Each meal was a sermon on patience. Each spice a verse in the language of control. We still fight wars with what we're allowed to hold. Words, spoons, silence." When she died in 1958, the book was unpublished, hidden among her belongings. It resurfaced in 2001, reprinted by her great-granddaughter, a chef and activist who opened a restaurant in New Orleans called Magnolia and Fire. On the first page of every menu, she printed her ancestors' words. "I was never trying to destroy the world. I was trying to make it remember." The return to the river in the year 2005, long after storms and floods reshaped the Mississippi Delta, divers exploring near Natchez discovered the remnants of a small wooden boat, half buried in silt. Inside lay rusted utensils, a silver ladle, and a fragment of porcelain plate etched faintly with initials. CD historians debated authenticity, but locals didn't need convincing. They said the river was finally spitting back what it had promised to keep. The river, they said, was full, not of guilt, but of remembrance. At sunset, the divers swore they saw a pale shimmer across the surface, as if light itself bent into the shape of a woman walking away. The legacy lives today. The descendants of Clara Doyle still cook, some in restaurants, some in homes, some in quiet corners where history doesn't reach. They season with precision, they stir with purpose, and before serving, they whisper her name, not as prayer, as gratitude, because Clara Doyle didn't die in the river. She dissolved into it, and from her flowed generations who learned that to cook is to control, to measure is to know, and to know is to be free. The final words. "Freedom," she once wrote, "isn't a place. It's the moment you stop waiting for permission." That was the real recipe she left behind. Not one written in ink, but in blood, courage, and quiet rebellion. Every daughter who stirred a pot, every mother who refused to bow, every teacher who passed on forbidden knowledge, they were all part of the meal she began in 1847. The taste of justice lingers. So does her name. And on humid southern nights, when the magnolias bloom and the river hums low, You can still smell her legacy rising in the air, soft, sweet, and sharp as truth itself.